This teenage boy uncovered his father's darkest secret, and it cost him his life. In November of 2012, 13-year-old Dylan Redwine vanished during a court-ordered Thanksgiving visit with his father Mark in the mountains of Colorado. From the start, Mark claimed Dylan simply ran away, but investigators grew suspicious when they found the boy's blood splattered across the living room floor and furniture, with cadaver dogs alerting to the scent of human decomposition inside the home and in Mark's truck. Still, without a body, police couldn't arrest him. As the case gained national attention, Mark even appeared on Dr. Phil in 2013, sitting beside his ex-wife and older son to plead his innocence on live TV. But the disturbing truth began to unravel in 2015, when hikers discovered Dylan's partial remains scattered across the woods, while his skull was found miles away with multiple fractures from blunt force trauma. The motive that eventually emerged was almost too grotesque to believe. Dylan had found humiliating photos of his father dressed in women's lingerie and eating feces from a diaper, and told friends he planned to confront him about it. Investigators believe that confrontation happened the night he arrived for Thanksgiving, ending with Dylan being beaten to death, his body dumped in the mountains to hide the evidence. In 2021, nearly a decade after his son went missing, Mark Redwine was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 48 years in prison for killing his own son to silence the disgusting proof of his darkest secrets. Her husband's disgusting secret drove her insane, and what she did next was pure horror. In 2020, 59-year-old Corinna Smith from Cheshire, England, learned that her husband Michael Baines had allegedly been sexually abusing their children for years. Enraged and unable to sleep, she boiled a pot of water, stirred in 3 bags of sugar to make it thicker and stickier, then poured the scalding mixture over him as he lay in bed. The sugar turned the water into a syrup that clung to his skin, causing burns so deep they exposed his flesh. Baines screamed in agony and survived for 5 excruciating weeks before succumbing to his injuries. Smith later told police she simply lost control after finding out what he'd done. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 12 years.
I'm being treated like a murderer?
No.
I just love my baby.
Not at all. I know that. And I know this isn't easy for you.
In July of 2024, 34-year-old Arizona father Christopher Schultz left his 2-year-old daughter strapped in her car seat for nearly 3 hours in blistering 109-degree heat while he stayed inside playing video games, drinking beer, and watching porn. He claimed he'd left the air conditioning on in the car, but investigators discovered the car's engine automatically shut off after 30 minutes, cutting the AC long before the child's death. When his wife came home, she found their daughter unresponsive and covered in sweat. It wasn't the first time either. His 2 older daughters later told investigators that he had left them in the car many times before, sometimes for long stretches. His wife had even texted him warnings, writing, "I told you to stop leaving them in the car. How many times have I told you?" That day, after realizing what had happened, Schultz frantically texted her, writing, "Babe, I'm sorry. How could I do this? I killed our baby. This can't be real." She responded in devastation, saying, "We've lost her. She was perfect." Digital evidence revealed that during those same hours, he'd been browsing porn sites and gaming as his daughter slowly roasted outside, what prosecutors later called a grotesque display of neglect and self-absorption. Schultz was charged with first-degree murder and child abuse, though he ultimately accepted a plea to second-degree murder with a 20 to 30-year sentence. Then, in a final twist, he recently took his own life just hours before being booked into prison for his sentence. Alright people, welcome back. Now apparently, while a lot of you enjoy watching these videos, you almost always forget to hit the like button and subscribe. So, if you enjoy these breakdowns and compilations of the strange, ridiculous, and sometimes downright morbid facts of our world, do me a quick favor, hit the like button and subscribe. That way, you'll keep seeing more of this stuff whenever I upload. In 1995, 6-year-old Elisa Izquierdo from Brooklyn became the face of one of the most horrifying child abuse cases in New York history. After years of living safely with relatives, Elisa was placed back in the care of her biological mother, Awilda Lopez, despite repeated warnings from family members and school officials about ongoing abuse and neglect. Almost immediately, neighbors and teachers noticed that Elisa had changed. She often arrived at school bruised, withdrawn, and terrified to go home. Over the next year, Awilda subjected her daughter to relentless cruelty. Elisa was often locked in a dark room for hours, forced to eat scraps or nothing at all, and denied basic care. Witnesses later recalled hearing her cry for help through the walls, while her mother screamed insults and accused her of being evil. She was beaten repeatedly, forced to sleep on the floor, and frequently sent to school with visible marks that no one acted on. In November of 1995, the abuse reached its breaking point. A wheel that slammed Elisa's head into a concrete wall, inflicting a massive head injury that caused fatal brain damage, and by the time paramedics arrived, she couldn't be saved. Autopsy findings revealed injuries consistent with chronic physical and sexual abuse, including genital trauma and signs of repeated violation. Awilda was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. After serving over 2 decades, she was released in April of 2022, a decision that reignited outrage among those who still remember Elisa's case. Her case horrified New Yorkers not just because of its brutality, but because it was preventable. Teachers, neighbors, and relatives had all tried to report what was happening, yet every warning was ignored. In the aftermath, the city passed Elisa's law, aimed at preventing child welfare agencies from concealing such failures ever again. In February of 2022, 25-year-old Taylor Shabiznis killed her boyfriend in one of Wisconsin's most horrific crimes in modern history. During sex in the basement of his mother's home, she strangled 24-year-old Shad Therian to death after a night of heavy drug use. But what she did next was beyond comprehension. She continued to violate his body for hours, then used knives and a chainsaw to slice him apart, deliberately placing his severed head in a bucket and leaving it in plain view for his mother to find the next morning. When the woman went downstairs, she came face to face with the unimaginable, her son's head staring back at her from inside a blood-filled bucket. Shabiznis later told police they'd have fun trying to find the rest of him. And her violent behavior didn't end there. During a 2023 court hearing, she suddenly lunged at her own attorney, knocking him to the ground before being restrained by deputies. Shabiznis was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 2015, doctors were baffled when a healthy 5-year-old boy's sodium levels skyrocketed inside a New York hospital, setting off a mystery that would expose a horror no one saw coming. For years, 26-year-old Lacey Spears told friends and followers that her son Garnett was chronically ill, documenting his mysterious sickness online to garner sympathy. But when the 5-year-old was hospitalized in New York, doctors found his sodium levels had mysteriously spiked to near-fatal levels, 182 milliequivalents per liter, so abnormally high that staff initially thought it was a lab error. Surveillance footage later showed Lacey taking her son into a private room and secretly administering large amounts of salt through his feeding tube. Hours later, Garnett suffered massive brain swelling and passed away. Investigators later found feeding bags in her apartment coated with salt residue, along with Google searches for dangers of high sodium in children. Spears was eventually sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, her case becoming a chilling example of Munchausen syndrome by proxy taken to the extreme. This was the final footage of Sandra Cantu before she was brutally murdered by someone everyone trusted. In 2009, 8-year-old Sandra Cantu vanished from her trailer park in Tracy, California after heading out to play. While police suspected a male predator who had touched Sandra before, the real killer was someone nobody expected. 28-year-old Sunday school teacher Melissa Huckabee, whose daughter was Sandra's friend. When Sandra went missing, Huckabee immediately inserted herself into the case, texting Sandra's mother strange messages about something being stolen at the exact time Sandra disappeared, and even claiming she found a note describing Sandra locked in a suitcase and tossed in the water. But witnesses had already seen her near an irrigation pond that same day, looking frantic and making a flimsy excuse that she had to pee before speeding off. Surveillance footage soon sealed her fate, showing Sandra walking toward Huckabee's trailer at 3:54 p.m., and Huckabee's SUV leaving the area just 8 minutes later. Police searched the church where she taught and found a rolling pin with a bent handle and a smear of Sandra's blood. Investigators believe Huckabee drugged Sandra, beat her up, sexually assaulted her with the rolling pin, then smothered and strangled her before stuffing the body into a suitcase and dumping it in the pond where it was recovered 10 days later. The seemingly trustworthy Sunday school teacher never explained why she killed her. Prosecutors suspect a twisted Munchausen-style urge for attention, someone willing to murder an innocent child just to make herself part of the tragedy. In 1998, 21-year-old Matthew Shepard was lured from a Wyoming bar by 2 men who pretended to be his friends. They drove him to the edge of town, robbed him, and savagely beat him before tying him to a wooden fence and leaving him to die in the freezing wind. 18 hours later, a passing cyclist found him comatose and barely alive, his face so bloody that he was first mistaken for a scarecrow. Matthew had been pistol-whipped and was beaten so brutally that his face was completely covered in blood, except for where it had been partially cleansed by his tears. The injuries were deemed too severe for doctors to operate, as Matthew died 5 days later from massive head trauma. Prosecutors argued the attack was fueled by robbery and deep-seated homophobia, something one of the killers later admitted to. Both men, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, were convicted of felony murder and sentenced to life in prison while narrowly avoiding the death penalty. He convinced her he was a 300-year-old werewolf, and it led to one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. In 2006, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson fell into a secret relationship with 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke, a self-proclaimed 300-year-old werewolf with a history of abuse, drugs, and violent fantasies. The pair openly talked about murdering people, even modeling themselves after natural-born killers. On the night of April 23rd, Steinke slipped into the Richardson home while high and drunk and stabbed Jasmine's mother 24 times, then brutally killed her father after telling him it's what your daughter wanted. Upstairs, Jasmine murdered her 8-year-old brother as he tried to defend himself with a toy lightsaber. Hours later, instead of hiding, the couple went to a party laughing, making out, and laughing about how her little brother gargled as he died. Arrested the next morning, Jasmine became Canada's youngest person ever convicted of multiple murders. She served the maximum youth sentence, had her record completely wiped in 2020, changed her name, and now lives in the community. While Steinke, now calling himself Jackson May, serves life with parole eligible in 2032. This woman convinced herself she needed human blood to survive the way other people need food. Starting in 1989, Brisbane's Tracy Wigington started killing animals, storing their bodies, and drinking their blood in private feedings before deciding she needed a living human victim. With 3 friends, she lured 47-year-old Edward Baldock into her car and drove him to a riverbank. The moment he stepped out, Wigington ambushed him with a hunting knife so violently that investigators said the wounds were frenzied and his throat was sliced so deep his head was nearly severed. She crouched over him as he died and drank from the blood pouring from the gash in his neck. Detectives later said the scene was so saturated with blood it looked ritualistic, and photos recovered from Wigington showed she'd been staging mock sacrifices with her friends in the months leading up to the murder. When police searched her belongings, they also found jars of preserved animal remains and notebooks describing her goal of becoming a fully transformed vampire. She pleaded guilty and received life in prison, yet still walked free in 2012, leaving one of Australia's most senseless and sadistic murders behind her. On August 9, 2021, 40-year-old surf instructor Matthew Taylor Coleman drove his 2 children, 2-year-old Khaleo and 10-month-old Roxy, from Santa Barbara across the border into Mexico, telling his wife he was taking them on a short trip. But instead, he brought them to a remote ranch near Rosarito and murdered both children with a spearfishing gun. When arrested hours later, he confessed in disturbing detail, telling the FBI he believed his kids had inherited serpent DNA and that QAnon-style conspiracy theories had convinced him he needed to kill them to save the world. Agents said he showed no signs of remorse, only fear that he had made a mistake. Coleman was charged with 2 counts of murder and remains in federal custody awaiting trial. Misty Lohman's viral mugshots came in the midst of years of personal and medical collapse. Before these images were taken, she had endured the losses of 3 infants in a short span, 1 miscarriage, 1 stillborn, and 1 that died shortly after birth, and she soon turned to drugs to cope with the unimaginable grief. At the same time, her health was unraveling from lupus, bone cancer, and scleroderma, a disease that thins and tightens the skin and can drastically change a person's appearance. As her condition worsened, she was arrested repeatedly for low-level drug charges, including possession, paraphernalia, and failure to appear in court, producing the series of shocking mugshots that later spread online without context. In the years since, Misty has entered long-term treatment, has been sober for 5 years, and now speaks openly about her medical conditions and the losses that shaped her life, pushing back against the misinformation and cruel insults that followed those photos. A little after 1 a.m. inside their Texas City home, 15-year-old Jaden Gonzalez was handling a pistol when it suddenly went off, the bullet hitting his 17-year-old brother Joshua in the chest. Their father, 41-year-old Jay Gonzalez, was right there when the shot rang out and immediately dropped to the floor to help, desperately trying to stop the bleeding and keep Joshua conscious. But in the middle of the chaos, with his son dying right in front of him, Jay's body gave out. He collapsed from a medical emergency believed to be a heart attack. By the time paramedics arrived, Joshua was already gone and Jay couldn't be revived. Police confirmed the shooting was accidental, leaving the family with 2 tragic deaths within the span of minutes. These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia lured his two daughters, 9-year-old Faith and 6-year-old Liberty, to his Dallas apartment for what was supposed to be a routine visitation, even though he was already wanted for violating probation after threatening their mother, Mary Jean Pearl. Furious that she had reported him, he called her on speaker and forced the girls to the phone so that she could hear everything. As Mary Jean begged them to run away, Faith's last words were, "No, Daddy, please don't do it," followed by the sound of multiple gunshots. Battaglia shot both girls with a .45 caliber revolver, then calmly left the apartment, went to a tattoo shop, and had 2 roses inked on his arm to honor them. When police arrived, the girls were found posed and surrounded by their toys. Battaglia showed no remorse at trial, smirked at the prosecutors, and even blew kisses at spectators in the courtroom. He was sentenced to death and eventually executed in 2018, calling himself the happiest man alive moments before the injection. This woman's crimes were so horrific that she became the first female in the history of France to receive a full life sentence. In 2022, 12-year-old Lola Davier disappeared after school in Paris, and security footage from the apartment building where she lived with her family showed her walking inside with 27-year-old Dabia Ben-Kirid following closely behind. Hours later, Lola's body was found stuffed inside a plastic storage box in the lobby of that same building. Investigators say Ben-Kirid lured the girl into her own sister's apartment, who lived upstairs, where she forced Lola to shower, taped her face, stabbed her repeatedly, and subjected her to what the judge called true torture, ultimately killing her through asphyxiation before eventually decapitating her. Ben-Kirid initially confessed, then kept changing her story, and even showed complete indifference when confronted with photos of the gruesome crime. In 2025, she became the first woman in French history to receive a whole life sentence, a punishment previously reserved for only 4 men. The tragedy deepened when Lola's father died in 2024 from alcohol-related complications brought on by the grief of losing his daughter. This was the photo that gave police hope they might find James Bulger alive, but instead, it became one of the most haunting crime photos ever taken. In February of 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger disappeared. In the 2 seconds his mother let go of his hand in a Liverpool shopping center, and police initially felt relieved when security footage showed him leaving with 2 young boys, not an adult predator, but that relief quickly diminished as they slowly learned the horrific truth. Over the next 2 hours, 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson dragged James through back streets, kicked and punched him, threw him onto his head, smeared paint in his eye, force-fed him batteries, pelted him with bricks and stones, and beat him with a 22-pound iron bar. At one point, they tried to push him into traffic, and several witnesses later admitted they didn't intervene because they assumed James was their younger brother. Their assaults left 42 separate injuries, including multiple skull fractures so extensive pathologists couldn't determine how or when James died. The boys then placed his body across train tracks to stage an accident, and a train later severed him, destroying critical evidence and delaying the discovery of the truth. When police identified the killers, expecting a violent man, not 2 10-year-olds, veteran officers said it was the most disturbing revelation of their careers. Both were sentenced to detention and released at 18 with lifelong anonymity, but Venables has since returned to prison multiple times for child abuse material, while Thompson has not reoffended, though he spent years blaming James's mother for the horrific murder, saying she never should have let go of his hand. Her selfish decision caused her toddler son to die in one of the most excruciating ways imaginable. In May of 2011, 2-year-old Kenton Brown died a slow, agonizing death inside his mother's car in Louisville, Kentucky. His mother, Molly Schaus, had stopped to buy drugs and passed out for nearly 12 hours, leaving her baby trapped in his car seat as the temperature inside the vehicle climbed to more than 130 degrees Fahrenheit. When she finally woke up, Kenton's tiny body was covered in sweat and blisters, his lips blue, and the buckle that held him in place had seared into his skin. Detectives said he had clawed away at his car seat straps and pulled his own hair out in a distressed panic before succumbing to heat and dehydration. Schaus was later found to be under the influence of Xanax and marijuana, and initially lied to police about what had happened, claiming she'd only been gone for a few minutes. A jury convicted her of wanton murder, calling it one of the most disturbing cases they'd ever seen. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, as the courtroom wept while prosecutors described Kenton's final moments, awake, terrified, and slowly dying alone inside the car his mother never returned to. In one of the most evil cases of betrayal ever recorded, a man from New Zealand secretly infected his wife with HIV using a sewing needle dipped in his own blood. After cheating on her and being diagnosed himself, he feared she would leave him. So while she slept, he pricked her leg, leaving only a tiny sting and a red mark. Months later, during a routine checkup, she tested positive for the virus and confronted him. He chillingly confessed, saying he only did it so she would be the same as me and would never leave. Prosecutors later called it an act of pure cruelty, and the man was sentenced to prison for willfully injecting another with a disease, a charge so rare that even the judge called it almost without precedent.